So I'm forced to speak some more. I was watching a video. I've actually seen quite a few things on it before, but for some reason tonight my brain started to spin on all the reasons that was really dumb. And it goes against the laws of nature, the laws of physics. Let's talk about that for a minute. We can prove that things in nature want to form into a sphere. For example, take a look at eggs. They're always kind of roundish, aren't they? You don't see a lot of flat ones, do you? Embryos in the womb form round. A mother's belly forms round. Your eyes form round. Your head is somewhat round and somewhat egg-shaped, but it's pretty much round. Our joints are rounded. It seems like a sphere forms very easily in nature for some strange reason. Take a drop of water, place it on a table, and even the top of that drop of water forms as a sphere, not as a flat. So let's look at a couple things. For one, if the earth was flat, there'd have to be forces making it flat, and we would see a lot more flat things in nature. We don't. We actually don't see flat things in nature. Kind of weird, right? I mean, if the whole universe is formed of flat objects, you'd think it would build flat objects. We'd see flat frogs running around with flat eyes. But there are none. In fact, we got a lot of round ones, though. Look at a whale. Look at a shark. Much like us, they incorporate a lot of spheres in their makeup, but nothing flat. Unless you consider the fin flat, which it is until you look at it from the front. Again, we see the curvature effect. Things being formed with a curve rather than flat. In fact, if you look across the face of the earth, you'll see one curved thing after another. Flowers, you don't see them forming flat, do you? They're circular. Most of the time, their flowers are circular. There are so many things in nature that form round. Why do raindrops form round instead of in flat sheets? So let's talk about some of the details. Let's just say, for a minute, now from what I understand, they basically assume that the earth is a flat disk, that it has always been a flat disk. Well, let's examine that for a second. Let's say we take a flat object and we superheat it and we let it cool. It cools very quickly. If we take a sphere and heat it to equal temperature of the same material, it always takes longer to cool. That being said, there's a couple points I want to touch on here in a row, and you'll see at the end they all come together. So on one part, we've got this whole things seem to form as a sphere in nature. In fact, if you're in space and you launch a droplet of water, it tries its best to form a sphere. And as soon as it stops bouncing around, like moving, from the squish of the water coming out of the hose or whatever else you released it with, it'll move, but you'll see it's forming a sphere. And when it loses its motion, if it hasn't hit a wall, it will form as a sphere. In fact, you can demonstrate that even here on Earth. It doesn't take zero gravity to make things form into a sphere. Look at eggs in nature. Open a salmon and examine its roe. They're all round. You ever wonder why that would happen? Why biology would produce so many round things in nature and nothing flat ever? Where do you see a flat animal? You don't. You see them made up of all these other shapes in nature. We have a lot of shapes. Flat ain't one of them. So let's say for a minute that we talk about the cooling effect. Let's put that aside for a second, because we're going to talk about how the Earth's core would stay molten. See, in a sphere, the outer crust forms as it cools, and then the inner crust is no longer exposed to the air or space, and so it cools much, much more slowly. In fact, there's an oven inside there now. The walls are heated. So there really isn't much heat transfer out of it. And with hundreds of miles or thousands of feet at least of thick rock above it, that actually is a really good insulator. And it explains very conveniently how we could still have a molten core all this time later. Aside from the fact that there are probably processes going on inside of the Earth that we don't understand that continue to keep heat building. If that were the case, it would only get hotter and hotter and hotter, just like turning up your oven. And eventually the surface would melt. No, the evidence is the opposite. The evidence is that it is slowly cooling. Well, if we take that flat object of metal, we take a flat sheet of metal. I grew up in a sheet metal shop, I know. It cools very quickly. But if we take a freaking sphere of metal and we cool that, the outer part cools about the same amount of time it would take for that flat sheet to cool. But that's only the outer layer. The inner layer takes a long time to cool. And so, there's that. Now let's take a look at a couple other things real quick. I just want to describe a couple of more things. So, we've got the fact that if it was flat, it would cool very quickly. Now we know that the Earth is billions of years old, and the only model that sufficiently explains why we would still have a molten core is for it to be a sphere. That's one thing. The other thing is about light and how light reacts off objects, period. If we take a sphere and we shine a light on it and we spin the sphere, we see that the light reflects very evenly across it. However, and it doesn't expose any edges because there aren't any. We just see a sphere rotating. In fact, it's really even hard to tell that it is rotating. We need to really study it to know that, because it looks like a perfect sphere. However, if we take a quarter or any other flat object and we spin it, the light reflects off it very differently and it becomes instantly obvious that it has an edge. Well, if all of these bodies in the universe are spinning, which they are, how come none of them are flat? How come they're all spheres? It seems like any body that forms in nature, even in space or on Earth, starts out as a sphere. From a baby to of any species that we could name, even ones who have live born young, they don't start in the shape of an animal. They start as an embryo. That's round. They start as an egg. We all come from a sphere. We are on a sphere. Nature produces spheres constantly, but it doesn't produce anything flat. You think it does? Take a look at me nose profile. Does that look flat to you? I didn't think so. What about all these curves? All these rounded things we have? But you don't think that nature is producing round objects? All right, fair enough. So let's take a look at what I call the pancake theory, which leads me to the Oreo theory. The pancake theory says it started as a sphere, and at one time it would have been a sphere, because that's how things naturally form, and we can prove that. And instead of it being a sphere, we squish it. Well, if we squish it like a pancake, because, God thought, hey, this would be awesome, let's make this one flat. So he stomped on it. Okay, so it's flat. The problem with the pancake theory is, in real scientific terms, for it to be crushed into a sphere, there would have to be a substantial force above and below crushing it. If there was force on only one side, it would just push the sphere across the space. It wouldn't crush it. There'd have to be a substantive force on top and bottom to crush that. Now that leads me to the Oreo theory. If it were being crushed, the molten magma would come out the sides. If you don't believe me, take an Oreo and squish it. It's got a soft core. Now, take an orange that has an equal crust all the way around, but is filled with liquid. Squish it. You notice the liquid doesn't really come out the top or the bottom if we squish it between, say, two flat plates or between two spherical objects. It still comes out the sides. Why would that be? It's physics. Okay, so if we crush an orange, take an orange and you crush it on the table, you'll notice its guts come out the sides. The same would be true if the spherical Earth had been crushed into a flat disk. The magma, by pressure, would have been forced out of it, which means we would no longer have a molten core. So either by virtue of the fact that it's cooling very quickly, or by virtue of the fact that we've squished it all out, if the Earth were really a flat disk, we would not have magma in the core of it anymore. The planet's billions of years old, and we can prove that it is. So aside from the fact that things form naturally in nature to a sphere, which they do, we can prove that. And in fact, everything it does, all life begins that way from what we can see. At least in terms of the egg. We have to assume then that things form that way in nature? Not necessarily. Let's assume they don't. If they don't, why are there so many natural spheres and so few, in fact zero that I can think of, flat objects? Even objects that appear to be flat, like a leaf bug. You look at them and they're not actually flat. They have 3D. They have rounded portions. Their eyes are round. Speaking of which, you know why our eyes are round? Because light reflects differently off a flat object than it does from a sphere. In fact, if our eyes were flat, we wouldn't have proper vision. See, we need those spheres that are our eyes for them to work properly. Just like this planet needs to be a sphere for it to work properly. The science for that is all around you. I just wanted to point on a couple of these things. So let's say we take a drop of water and we put it on the edge on a table. You'll notice that the bottom is flat. It's pressed up against the table. It doesn't have a choice. But the top, where it could form to any shape it wants, is a sphere. Take a look at it. Put a drop of water on a table and see for yourself. You'll see that it doesn't form like a ramp with a flat side that leads to the table. It forms like a sphere with a hump. Why would that be if spheres don't form in nature? Why would water or gas released in space automatically become a sphere? Not to mention the fact that if all of the other disks around us, if all those other apparently round objects are in fact disks, we would see them spinning. Just like you can see a coin when you flip it in the light. You see the light reflecting off the flat surfaces. Well, just like that, we would see it. It would be blatantly obvious every time you looked out into space. You'd look at the night sky, and our moon would be flickering. It would be flickering because it would be rotating. It is rotating, and we can prove that. We've also been to the right side, the left side, the top side, the bottom side, the dark side, and the light side, and they are all frickin' round. So that brings me back to the pancake theory and the Oreo theory. If we were squished and were at one time round, we wouldn't have a molten core. If we were created if we were created flat, whether it was round or square or whatever, this would have to be an incredibly thick, flat disk to take this long to cool. And because things in nature really do form as a sphere naturally, and including in space, why did it form flat? What forces were there that forced it to be flat, when every other planet in our solar system is round and the sun is round? Give that some thought, will you?